All right, this is the final lecture of U.S. History 1493. It will cover the 1960s and all of the uproar and chaos and turbulence and revolutionary potential, and then how all of that kind of falls apart. Spoiler alert. The 1960s is one of those decades that actually started on time. Decades tend to have stereotypes, right? The 1950s is the rock and roll decade, but the first rock and roll record wasn't released until 1954. Or the 1920s is the jazz age, the age of the flappers, but they don't really get going until 23, 24, 25. The 1960s, as a decade of really turbulent social change, pretty much started right on time. February 1960, 4 students from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, which is a black college in Greensboro, North Carolina, went into the local Woolworths, the old 5 and dimes. They bought a couple things, which made them customers, and then they sat down at the lunch counter, which was reserved for whites. They were told that they would not be served. They stayed in their seat until the store closed. They came back the next morning and stayed all day, and then the next, and the next. As the protest continued, other students, including a few local white students, joined in. These demonstrations spread to Woolworths all around the country. And after holding out for 5 months, in July, Woolworths agreed that they would serve black customers at their lunch counters. Now, the sit-in reflected a lot of the frustration that especially young people had at the very slow pace of racial change. Greensboro, North Carolina prided itself on being better than a lot of surrounding cities. In 1954, Greensboro was the only city in the South to declare that they would voluntarily comply with the Brown decision. They're not going to do that massive resistance thing. But by 1960, only a handful of black students were actually going to integrated schools, and the economic gap had not been changed, and Greensboro was still segregated. And more than anything else, the Greensboro sit-ins kind of marked the beginning of the 1960s, this activism, this social change, in particular being led by students. The sit-ins had been held before, but it had never sparked such a massive response. Demonstrations based along these tactics began to take place all across the South, demanding integration not just of lunch counters, but of parks and libraries and swimming pools and other public facilities. By the end of 1960, about 70,000 demonstrators had taken part in sit-ins, and they were often attacked for it. Angry white Southerners would assault them, sometimes with dumb stuff, like opening ketchup and mustard bottles over their heads, sometimes by physically attacking them, beating them, trying to drag them out of the restaurant, putting out cigarettes on their skin. We need to remember that the nonviolent civil rights movement was only nonviolent on the protesters' side. The people who did not support civil rights were incredibly violent. Now, the civil rights movement challenged the United States to rethink what we really mean by freedom, whether or not freedom applies to all Americans or only to some. With their freedom rides and freedom schools and freedom marches, black Americans and their allies made freedom the rallying cry of the dispossessed. Thousands of ordinary people, maids and factory workers and farmers and students and teachers, risked physical and economic retaliation to demand freedom. And their courage inspired a lot of other challenges to the old status quo, a lot of other minority movements, plus the women's rights movement and the student movement as well. By the end of the 60s, those movements had challenged our understanding of freedom that was linked to the Cold War and to consumerism. They forced us to reconsider. They made us confront the fact that large groups of Americans were excluded from full participation in American freedom. And with these sit-ins in particular, college students became the leading force for social change, really for the first time. And you've kind of kept that position. In April of 1960, Ella Baker, a civil rights organizer, called for a meeting of young activists in Raleigh, North Carolina. And about 200 black students and a few white students attended. That gathering was the foundation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Now, this group, they were dedicated to creating what they called a beloved community. It's this brotherhood of justice, of cooperation, of people working together, of empowering ordinary people to take control of the decisions that affect their lives. One of the early activists with SNCC was Robert Moses, and he said, "We can't count on adults. That leaves the young people to be the agents of change." And one of the things that made SNCC different from the older, more mainstream groups is that those older groups like the NAACP and the Urban League had leaders at the top who made decisions and then told everybody else to carry it out. But SNCC operated by consensus. Everybody had a voice. They all got together, they decided what actions to take, how to do it, by everybody speaking and everybody voting. And SNCC became kind of the vanguard of the civil rights movement. They coordinated the sit-ins. They supported the more mainstream leaders of the movement. They organized the Freedom Rides. In 1961, the Supreme Court ordered all trains and buses to be desegregated. So a group of 13 SNCC volunteers traveled on a couple of different bus lines from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans to integrate the buses. When they hit South Carolina, they started experiencing some periodic mob violence. By the time they got to the Alabama border, the Klan knew they were coming, met them at the border, attacked the Greyhound bus, slashed the tires, set it on fire. Then they dragged the students off the other bus and beat them so severely that they were hospitalized. But the Freedom Rides continued over and over for months. SNCC also helped to organize a political party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The idea behind that was 64 is a presidential election year, so the Democratic National Convention was being held, and every state sends delegates. Well, African Americans were actually the majority in the state of Mississippi, but the state was so segregated and so gerrymandered that they held no federal or state office, hardly any local office. And SNCC and a lot of other people said that if free and fair constitutional elections were held, blacks would control the state's Democratic Party. But the official state Democratic Party wouldn't let them in. So SNCC organized the Freedom Democratic Party, and they elected their own delegates to send up to the Democratic National Convention. When they got there, they demanded to be seated. They said the official delegation had been elected illegally against the rules of the party in violation of federal law, which was true. Now, the Democratic Party has a credentials committee, and it's their job to make sure that the delegates who show up are the ones who should actually be there. So the credentials committee heard out the Mississippi Freedom Party, and they did it on national television. Now, by this point, this happened in '64. The American people had heard a lot about the mob violence that civil rights workers faced. They'd seen big mass protests. They'd seen things like Birmingham, which we'll get to in a minute. But in these hearings, they got to hear very personal stories. They heard from a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a sharecropper as well as an activist. She worked on land owned by one of Mississippi's congressmen, land that her husband's family had worked since before the Civil War. Back before the midterm, we talked about early eugenics and how some minority women were sterilized, had their reproductive organs taken out without their knowledge or consent. Well, Fannie Lou Hamer was one of those women. She had worked on voter registration drives. She had been part of literacy campaigns. She had been shot at. She had been arrested. She was beaten so badly by a sheriff's deputy at one point that she was blind in one eye and had permanent kidney damage. Her speech before the Credentials Committee, before the American people, was so powerful that the committee got thousands of letters and phone calls demanding that the Freedom Party be allowed to sit. But President Johnson was afraid that if he let the Freedom Party replace the official Mississippi Party, that all of the Southern delegates would leave, and that he wouldn't get the presidential nomination. He agreed to a compromise to just seat 2 of the Freedom Party members, but nobody was happy with that either. Most of the Mississippi delegation walked out anyway. When you read Malcolm X for your readings quiz, a lot of what he's saying, especially when he's specifically talking about President Johnson, was in reaction to this particular incident, to the Mississippi Freedom Party. How many people felt like President Johnson had betrayed African Americans after they had supported him. Now, SNCC was also important because of the role that women played. Because SNCC was a consensus group instead of a top-down organization, women had a significant voice. Women were often the majority in more traditional civil rights groups, but the other groups were led by men, so they didn't have a say, but they did in SNCC. Many leaders of the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s started out in SNCC, learning how to organize, learning publicity and legal maneuvers and group support, things that they will take with them. Now, the tone of SNCC will change in the mid-60s. It will turn away from the beloved community idea. And when that happens, women will almost entirely lose their voice. But in the beginning, they were a huge part of the leadership. Now, the high point of protest came in the spring of '63. Demonstrations took place in towns and cities all across the South. It brought attention to inequality in education and jobs and housing. In 1 week in June, there were more than 15,000 arrests in 186 cities. Now, the culmination came in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was one of the most proudly segregationist cities. Even for the Deep South, Birmingham was considered particularly bad. Since the end of World War II, more than 50 black homes had been bombed. The locals had been demonstrating for a while without actually making any headway. Now, some of the leaders in Birmingham, the leaders of the civil rights movement, invited Martin Luther King to come and help try and come up with some new tactics. In May, they decided to send school kids, junior high and high school kids, to march in Birmingham, acting on the idea that even in Birmingham, the police are not going to attack kids. But they were wrong. Bull Connor, the chief of police, turned dogs loose on the kids. Police beat them with nightclubs. They turned fire hoses on them that will strip the bark off a tree. Doesn't sound like a high point, but what happened in Birmingham made the front page of almost every major newspaper, not just in the United States, but around the world. It was on the evening news all across the country. The Birmingham campaign became a triumph for the civil rights movement. Because of this, President Kennedy began to support the movement. Birmingham's business community knew that their city was becoming a symbol of brutality, so they very quickly agreed to desegregate the stores and the restaurants and start hiring black workers. But much more important than that, the events in Birmingham forced white Americans to decide what side they're on. Are you on the side of your fellow citizens who want protections for really very basic rights? Or are you on the side of people who will attack children? And the question became even more insistent as the summer went on. In June of '63, a sniper killed Medgar Evers. He was the secretary for the Birmingham NAACP. In September, a bomb was set off at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. In the middle of Sunday school, killed 4 little girls. Everybody knew who did it. The last of the conspirators was not convicted until 2002. On August 28, 1963, a couple weeks before the church bombing, 250,000 black and white Americans met at Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington, which is often considered the high point of the nonviolent phase of the civil rights movement. It was the biggest public demonstration up to that time. The major goal of this march was to get a civil rights bill passed through Congress. But the goals of the march included a bunch of other things as well. They wanted a public works program to cut unemployment. They wanted an increase in the minimum wage. They wanted a federal law against job discrimination. Those demands, those economic demands, revealed how, for this moment at least, the black movement had forged an alliance with white groups. One of the slogans was jobs and freedom, because economic issues affect everybody. On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech, which, if you've heard or read any of his speeches, it's probably that one. And in fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that is probably the only Martin Luther King speech that you've ever heard or read. It is an extremely moderate speech. He's talking before 250,000 people. He's on the radio. He's on TV. There are a lot of things that he would say in smaller speeches that he did not say at Birmingham. The March on Washington reflected an unprecedented degree of cooperation between black and white Americans in support both of racial justice and economic justice. But it also showed some of the limitations of the movement and some of the tensions that were already cropping up. Even though women had played crucial roles in organizing this march, no woman was allowed to speak at the Lincoln Memorial. And in fact, the more traditional organizers ordered the SNCC speaker, a young man named John Lewis, to tone down his speech considerably. The original version of his speech called for the people to march through the heart of Dixie the way Sherman did and burn Jim Crow to the ground. You can't say that. You can't say that in front of 250,000 people. You can't say that when you're standing in Virginia on television. It gets you in a lot of trouble. They made him take that part out. Lewis's rhetoric was a sample of the much more radical turn that many young people in the movement would soon take. One banner somebody carried said, "Seek the freedom in 1963 that was promised in 1863. 1863 is when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. Civil rights activists pointed out that in 1863, federal authority had been the thing to protect their freedom, and they want that federal authority to bear on social justice issues now. Despite the fact that for many decades the federal government had actually promoted segregation, movement leaders believed that they could expect more justice from national government than from local government. But at this point it was not entirely clear whether the feds were worthy of that faith. In particular, because the president during the march was not overly interested in civil rights. John F. Kennedy served as president for less than 3 years, and in domestic affairs really didn't have a lot of tangible accomplishments. Of course, we still remember him as, in everybody's top 10 favorite presidents. He's this very glamorous figure, very dynamic leadership. Revelations about his personal life have not significantly damaged any of that. When Kennedy took office in January of '61, his speech talked about the need for change. He said, "The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans who will pay any price, bear any burden to assure the survival and success of liberty." He said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." But while the civil rights movement was already in full swing, the speech said jack about segregation or race relations. At the start of his presidency, Kennedy really seemed to believe that civil rights were a distraction from his main concern, which is winning the Cold War. Kennedy's agenda had a whole bunch of new programs and initiatives aimed at containment, stopping the spread of communism, and also, if possible, reversing it where it already existed. One of his first acts to stop the spread of communism and to promote American national security was the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps sends kids, young Americans, to overseas countries, mostly to developing countries, to build schools and dig wells and stuff. How does that aid national security and stop the spread of communism? It's kind of like the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was built around the idea that chaos and insecurity create breeding grounds for radical ideas like communism. So if Americans go to El Salvador and build a school or help these communities in some way, then people won't need radical ideas like communism. And for national security, it builds up America's reputation. I mean, say you've got a group of 200 American Peace Corps volunteers that go into Honduras, and they're doing all this activity, and lots of people in this area meet them, and then the Soviets come in, and they're like, the Americans are bad, they're capitalist pigs, blah, 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 trying to destroy the world. Then the people who have seen these volunteers can say, wait, but no, we met Americans. We know them. They held my kids. They taught at this school. They did this well. We know they're not that bad. Maybe a little bad. Not that bad, though. By 1966, more than 15,000 young men and women were serving as Peace Corps volunteers. In April of '61, the Soviets put the first man into space. And Kennedy said, well, that sucks, but you know what we're going to do? We're going to do one better. We will send the first man to the moon, and we're going to do it by the end of the decade. Now, when he said that in 1961, folks thought he was crazy. But to everybody's surprise, that was achieved in 1969. Kennedy also came up with a new policy toward Latin America. The Alliance for Progress is what it was called. Basically a Marshall Plan for the Western Hemisphere. It was supposed to decrease poverty, it was supposed to stabilize the economies, it was supposed to make communism less appealing. The problem was most of the countries that we gave money to under this program, most of those countries were controlled by military dictatorships and by local elites. So they kept the money. They made themselves rich, while the poor people of that country saw no benefit, but they saw Americans giving a lot of money to their dictators. Now, just like the presidents before him, Kennedy viewed the entire world through the lens of the Cold War. But JFK was the first president to have lived his entire life in a world with a major communist power. He was born in 1917, after the Russian Revolution. He was only in his mid-20s when the Cold War started. So that definitely shaped the way he saw the world. It's almost like he took it more personally than Truman and Eisenhower, because they remembered a world. They had been adults when the Soviet Union was first established. They knew what it was like before then. And so Kennedy's lifelong experience with the Soviets, never knowing a world without them, definitely shaped how he dealt with other countries, like Cuba. Now, Cuba had been an economic dependent of the United States because of the Spanish-American War and the Platt Amendment and blah, blah, blah. Well, in 1959, Cuba had a revolution that got rid of their American-backed dictator and brought Fidel Castro, who was a communist, to power. Now, when Castro's government took over, they began to nationalize land holdings and industries that used to be owned by American companies. And then Castro agreed that he would have a trade partnership with the Soviets. And of course, we don't like that. So Eisenhower, in 1959, he's the president, he issued an embargo against Cuba. There is a suspension of trade with Cuba. And the CIA began to train Cuban exiles, anti-Castro exiles, to invade Cuba and get rid of him. Well, Eisenhower never got around to putting that plan in place, but Kennedy did. In April of 1961, JFK allowed the CIA to launch that invasion at a site known as the Bay of Pigs. Now, Kennedy's military advisors predicted that the people of Cuba will rise up against Castro, they will overthrow the government, they will greet these invaders as liberators. They were almost entirely wrong. There were in the realm of 1,400 exiles who had been trained for this program. None of them had any real military experience. The people who left Cuba when Castro came to power were CEOs, they were bankers, they were college professors, they were doctors and lawyers. Even with the CIA's help, they were not prepared for this. In the space of a few hours, more than 100 of them were killed and 1,100 were captured. Well, the Kennedy administration disavowed all knowledge, left the people who were captured in Castro's hands. Cuba, of course, is angry about this. They become much more closely tied to the Soviets, and the Kennedy administration began to try a number of increasingly desperate assassination attempts, not a one of which actually worked. Meanwhile, the relationship between the United States and the Soviets directly deteriorated. In August of '61, this stuff is all happening in Kennedy's first year, worst first year ever. In August of '61, the Soviets built a wall to separate West Berlin from East Berlin. You know, the Soviets control East Germany, which by this point has solidified into its own country. The United States and Britain and France control West Germany, which by this point has solidified into its own country. But Berlin, the former capital, still the capital of East Germany, it is in the Soviet territory, and part of it is still allied with the West. Well, East Berlin was hemorrhaging citizens. Every night, like 100 East Germans would go to dinner in West Berlin, and the next morning, 3 would come back. So the Soviets want to stop losing their citizens to the West, and they build this wall. They put it up in the middle of the night. They put up a barbed wire fence in the middle of the night, and it stood there until 1989 as a tangible symbol of the Cold War and the division of Europe. But the most dangerous crisis of the Kennedy administration, and in many ways the entire Cold War, came in October of '62. American spy planes discovered that the Soviets were installing missiles in Cuba that were capable of reaching the United States with nuclear weapons. And we have no clue what their motives were. Maybe they wanted to change the balance of power. Maybe they wanted to keep us from invading Cuba again. We don't know. They're still not saying. They probably did not intend to actually use them because that would have sparked us firing on them. That would be stupid. But the Kennedy administration cannot tolerate having missiles that close to the United States. Cuba's only 90 miles from Florida. They could take out half of our strategic spring break reserve in one shot. Now Kennedy, his advisors had a whole lot of suggestions. We should invade Cuba, we should do this, we should nuke them. Kennedy instead decided to blockade the island and demand that the Soviets take their missiles out. After very tense behind-the-scenes negotiations, Khrushchev, still the Soviet premier, agreed to withdraw the missiles. Kennedy promised, we will not invade Cuba again, and we will take away some of our missiles that the Soviets felt were a little too close to their border. But for 13 days, the world is literally teetering on the brink of all-out nuclear war. This crisis seems to have lessened some of Kennedy's passion for the Cold War. He seems to have been really shocked, actually, by the very casual way that some of his military advisors talked about the possibility of provoking nuclear war. You know, we should invade Cuba. Well, okay, that'll cause a nuclear war. That's okay. literally saying a war where tens of millions of Americans and Russians will absolutely die is okay, because in the end we'll win. Kennedy, after this, really tried to reduce a lot of the tensions. He called for greater cooperation with the Soviets. He gave this big speech saying that we should not view this as a battle between good and evil, which is a complete opposite of what he said when he came into office. That summer, we both agreed, the U.S. and the Soviets both agreed to a test ban treaty. We're not going to test new nuclear weapons. Kennedy even sent word to Castro that he wanted a more constructive relationship with Cuba. So in his first 2 years in office, Kennedy is really preoccupied with foreign policy. But in 1963, the crisis over civil rights moved to the forefront. Until then, Kennedy was really reluctant to take a forceful stand. The head of the FBI was J. Edgar Hoover, and Hoover believed that the civil rights movement was a communist plot. They're trying to take our attention away from the Cold War. They're trying to undermine the United States. And for quite a while, Kennedy seemed to agree with him. The U.S. Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, approved FBI wiretaps on Martin Luther King and several other leaders. Now, despite a campaign promise to ban housing discrimination, Kennedy actually didn't do much in terms of civil rights. He would use federal force when segregationists really egregiously broke federal law. He ordered federal troops to integrate the University of Mississippi. But he would not really do anything to protect civil rights workers from violence. He said law enforcement is a local matter. He doesn't want to get into it. But the events in Birmingham in '63, that in particular forced his hand. Kennedy realized that the United States could not stand up in front of the world and say we're the champions of freedom while still maintaining a violently racist system at home. In June, he went on national TV to call for the passage of a law banning racial discrimination in all public accommodations. But he did not live to see that bill enacted. On November 22nd, '63, in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas, he was shot and killed. This is one of those things like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 or the fall of the Berlin Wall. An entire generation will remember where they were when they first heard that news. My mother still considers it one of the most defining moments of her life. She was in junior high, in health class, when somebody came in and made the announcement, and it was like, if somebody can kill the President of America, then nobody is safe. She said one of the other girls burst into tears, and people were saying, the Russians are going to drop the bomb right now because we're leaderless. They were in, where were they living at that point? Enid, yeah, Enid, Oklahoma. I'm not really sure that that was like a major Soviet target for them, but you know, when you grow up in the duck and cover generation, it's easy to imagine the worst. And then, of course, in the time that followed, there were all sorts of wild conspiracy theories about who had actually killed him and why and blah, blah, blah. And it made the whole global situation seem a lot more dangerous for a lot of people. Well, Vice President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, succeeded JFK. And it was his goal not just to shepherd this particular bill through Congress, but to launch this whole domestic program that was much more ambitious than anything Kennedy had ever envisioned. Kennedy and Johnson are very, very different people. Kennedy was raised in a wealthy, powerful family, seemed to view success as his birthright. Johnson grew up in the Texas Hill Country. He grew up in one of the poorest parts of the United States. He had to fight very hard to get to where he was. He had started his career as a school teacher in a segregated Latino school out in the Hill Country. And he never really forgot where he came from. Johnson was much more interested in domestic reform than Kennedy had been. Johnson really supported that old New Deal idea, that the government has an obligation to protect all of its citizens. But when he became president, Nobody expected that Johnson would put civil rights at the forefront of his administration, or that he would be so passionately involved with the movement. Which is not to say that there aren't valid criticisms of Johnson on civil rights. If you read Malcolm X, that is an extremely passionate criticism of Johnson, and it's totally legitimate. Johnson was often very cautious. He is a career politician. He is certainly concerned with his career. But just 5 days after Kennedy's assassination, Johnson called on Congress to enact the Civil Rights Bill as a memorial to JFK. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of '64 prohibits racial discrimination in jobs, in hospitals and schools and other public institutions, and also in private businesses, like restaurants and hotels and theaters. Now, the Civil Rights Act, the version that was passed, also banned discrimination on the basis of sex, which was not in the original version. That particular part of the act was added to the Civil Rights Bill by people who didn't want it to pass. They figured, all right, everybody will vote for racial civil rights, but if we add in rights for chicks, nobody will vote for that. We can kill this bill. But by this point, there are enough women in Congress and there are enough men supporting women's rights in Congress that it passed anyway. Now, Johnson knew that there were a lot of people who opposed this law. After he signed it, he turned to one of his aides and said, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party." Now, the 1964 law did not address suffrage, did not address the right to vote. And so that summer, a group of civil rights workers, mostly affiliated with SNCC, launched a voter registration drive in Mississippi. Hundreds of white college students from the North traveled to Mississippi to take part in Freedom Summer, they called it. And they were met with a massive outpouring of violence, including 35 bombings and hundreds of beatings. In June of '64, 3 young activists, 2 white and 1 black, were kidnapped by a group that included a deputy sheriff and murdered near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Between 1961 and '65, 25 black civil rights workers that we know of were murdered. But the deaths of 2 white students focused a lot of attention on Mississippi and on the apparent inability of the government to protect its citizens. A Freedom Summer also led directly to the founding of the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party, which so disrupted the Democratic National Convention. Now, the events at the Democratic Convention, when the Freedom Party delegates were refused seats, that severely weakened especially young activists' faith in the system, and it kind of forecast the coming breakup of the coalition between liberal Democrats and black civil rights workers. But for the moment, the movement agreed to rally behind President Johnson anyway. Johnson's opponent, the Republican candidate, was a senator from Arizona. His name was Barry Goldwater. Goldwater had written a best-selling book called The Conscience of a Conservative. That book mostly was very critical of Johnson's domestic policies. In fact, he went all the way back to the New Deal to criticize that as well. Goldwater said that private charities should replace Social Security, and he called for a flat income tax. That should sound very familiar to you. A lot of the more recent elections deal with the very things that Barry Goldwater was talking about. Like Ross Perot in the '92 election wanted a flat tax. Steve Forbes, every time he runs on a flat tax. Replacing welfare and Social Security with private charity. George W. Bush was into that. Huge part of the 2000 campaign. Barry Goldwater, in '64, he is a political disciple of Alf Landon. the guy who ran against FDR. And Goldwater is a bridge between Alf Landon in the 30s and small government and anti-government conservatives today. The Democrats painted Goldwater as an extremist who will repeal Social Security, send the country back into a depression, and then Goldwater suggested that perhaps nuclear war would be acceptable as long as we win. That was the wrong thing to say at exactly the wrong time. He suffered an absolutely disastrous defeat. He got 27 million popular votes. Johnson got almost twice that. Democrats swept to a 2-to-1 majority in both houses of Congress. So nobody really realized at the time what actually happened here. What happened in 1964 was a milestone in the rebirth of American conservatism. Goldwater, as a Republican, carried 5 states in the Deep South, the entire southern coast, from Louisiana to South Carolina, except for Florida. That, if people had paid attention not just to the overall outcome of the election, that would have been a very prophetic moment. Another indication of potential problems for the Democrats came in California. In 1963, the state of California passed a law banning racial discrimination in real estate sales. But in the '64 election, California passed Prop 14. Prop 14 repealed the Fair Housing Law. 75% of the white votes cast in California was for Prop 14. But there was still one last triumph ahead for the civil rights movement. In January of '65, Martin Luther King launched a voting rights campaign in Selma, Alabama. Selma, Alabama had about 15,000 black residents. 355 of them were registered to vote. Well, they're trying to have this voter registration drive. They decide to march from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery. And the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, says, "You cannot do this." He banned any marches, any parades, any demonstrations. And the marchers tried to go anyway. When they reached the bridge heading out of Selma, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, state police were waiting for them. They were ordered to disperse. The leaders of the march asked if they could have a moment to pray, and then the state police assaulted them with tear gas, whips, and cattle prods. Doesn't sound like much of a victory, does it? But just like Birmingham, the public outcry forced Johnson to step up. And he strongly encouraged / bullied Congress into passing a Voting Rights Act. In his speech before Congress, Johnson called Selma a milestone in man's unending search for freedom. The Voting Rights Act allowed federal officials, not locals, to register voters. Black Southerners finally regained protection of the vote that they lost in the Jim Crow era. In addition to this, Congress also passed the 24th Amendment, which outlawed the poll tax. We're still fighting this battle. Late spring, early summer 2013, the Supreme Court overturned part of the Voting Rights Act. There was a section of the Voting Rights Act that set out criteria to decide which states basically need extra oversight. And the Supreme Court said you can't do that. So now that extra oversight has been removed from the Voting Rights Act. And in the aftermath of this, we're seeing huge amounts of voter restrictions being put in place. But by 1965, with court orders, with new federal laws, the civil rights movement had managed to end almost all legal barriers to full first-class citizenship. Now, after his landslide victory in '64, Johnson outlined a very sweeping proposal for government action. He called it the Great Society. The Great Society programs provided health service to the poor and the elderly, created Medicaid and Medicare, The Great Society poured a lot of money into education, into urban development. Johnson created new cabinet-level offices, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. HUD is huge around here. Created new agencies like the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Public Broadcasting System. So if you enjoy PBS today, if you grew up watching Sesame Street or reading Rainbow or Bill Nye the Science Guy, thank President Johnson, because PBS would not exist without the Great Society programs. Those programs also extended the power of the federal government, and they extended most of the social welfare programs, except for national health insurance, which still did not get passed. A lot of these programs are very similar to New Deal programs. But unlike the New Deal, the Great Society was a response to prosperity. The New Deal programs had been put in place during the Depression to try and dig us out of a bad situation and get us on solid ground, basically. The mid-1960s, though, was a time of expansion. More government spending, tax cuts on individuals and businesses. Johnson believed that this economic boom that we were having made it possible to create these new programs, to create a way to permanently improve the quality of life. Now, the centerpiece of the Great Society programs, though, was the war on poverty. After all the talk about affluence in the 1950s, poverty came back into the conversation during the 1960s. Poverty had not gone away during the 50s. It had decreased, but it had not gone away. And in the early 1960s, a solid 40 to 50 million Americans lived in poverty. Most of them, though, were living in places where you didn't have to look at them. They lived in isolated rural areas. They lived in the inner cities where the middle class didn't have to pay attention. Now, the civil rights movement in particular championed economic change, the needs of the poor. Now, the majority of people living below the poverty line were white people, but the civil rights movement believed that everybody needed to be lifted up. Part of the reason for that is that when you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you get scared. And when people are afraid, they get angry. And sometimes you can trick people into pointing their anger at other poor people instead of at the systems that keep everyone poor and uneducated. During the 30s, during the New Deal, people who supported those programs believed that poverty was caused by an imbalance in economic power, by flawed institutions. In the 60s, though, Johnson's administration blamed poverty on a lack of work skills, a lack of proper attitude and work habits. They don't have the old Protestant work ethic. So the war on poverty didn't actually deal with the most effective and direct ways of eliminating poverty. Didn't do anything with guaranteed income or job creation or unionization or stopping businesses from moving overseas. Nor did Johnson deal with the economic changes that were taking away good-paying manufacturing jobs and leaving working-class families falling further and further behind. Now, one of the Great Society's most successful components, the food stamp program, did offer direct aid to the poor. But in general, the war on poverty concentrated on building job skills and motivation. The Office of Economic Opportunity created a series of programs designed to lift the poor into the economic mainstream. It provided things like job training and legal services, and need-based college scholarships, and Head Start, which is one of the most unbelievably successful programs of the war on poverty. They also created VISTA, which is like the Peace Corps, but instead of going to El Salvador, you go to Mott Haven in New York. It's a Peace Corps for the inner cities. VISTA became part of the AmeriCorps program, which still exists. The war on poverty drew heavily on the philosophy of the civil rights movement. SNCC, in particular, the students' movement, they had insisted that average people should have control over their own lives. So the war on poverty required that the poor have leadership roles in designing local policies. Unfortunately, that caused some conflict with politicians who were not used to sharing power over the money. Now, Johnson defined the Great Society using the rhetoric of freedom that came from the New Deal and from the Civil Rights Movement together. Johnson kind of brought back that idea of freedom from want, which we'd almost forgotten in the 1950s. Johnson said that when a man is hungry and out of work and cannot provide for his family, he's not free. That's part of Johnson's definition of freedom. Johnson also wanted to take another look at the relationship between freedom and equality. Johnson said that black poverty was fundamentally different than white poverty because black poverty had its roots in centuries of denied opportunity and the continuation of prejudice. He said it wasn't enough to have equality as a theoretical right. We need equality in fact. We need effective freedom. Now, Johnson's Great Society did not actually achieve that, but it did represent a recommitment to the idea of the social citizen. It also tried to bring the power of the federal government up to meet the needs of all citizens, not just the wealthy. Now, the war on poverty, plus the high rate of economic growth, did succeed in significantly reducing the poverty rate. It was 22% when Eisenhower left office. It was 13% when Johnson left office. And it has hovered around the 13%-ish mark ever since. Now, by the 1990s, thanks to the ongoing civil rights movement, it's not over, thanks to that and the Great Society ideals, the historic gap between black and white Americans in education and income and access to jobs finally began to narrow quite a bit. But with deindustrialization, with urban decay, there were still a lot of problems to be dealt with. And even at its moment of triumph, the civil rights movement confronted a crisis. In the mid-1960s, economic issues came to the forefront of the civil rights agenda. And there were violent protests in ghettos outside the South. And that drew attention to the national scope of injustice and to inequalities in housing and jobs and education that the end of legal segregation didn't touch. Now, we usually refer to these as riots. It's the Watts riot and the Detroit riot. They're uprisings. They're attempted revolutions is what they are. They're battles between U.S. citizens who were being assaulted and attacked and predated on by a predominantly white police force, which in many cases acted more like an occupying army. The first of these erupted in Harlem in 1964. The Watts uprising in '65 was much larger and is probably the most famous. Watts is a neighborhood in Los Angeles. It became majority black during World War II, after the war industries finally began hiring African Americans. But during the 50s, Watts suffered tremendous loss of industry and jobs. White people move away, the jobs follow them, and black people can't go. People can't move out of the neighborhood, both because they weren't allowed to live in the suburbs and because moving is expensive. There were a number of incidents, really nasty incidents, of police violence against the citizens. And what sparked the Watts Rebellion was an incident with the police. An estimated 50,000 people took part in this rebellion. They attacked police and firemen, they looted businesses, they burned buildings, took 15,000 police and National Guard to restore order, by which time $30 million in property was destroyed. And there are people who will point to the Watts Uprising and will only talk about $30 million in property. They won't tell you about the 35 black people who died at the hands of police. They won't tell you about the 900 who were injured. Martin Luther King, in response to these uprisings as they spread, said that a riot is the cry of the dispossessed. It's what happens when nobody will look at you and nobody will listen to you and nobody will acknowledge what is being done to you and your communities until somebody sets some shit on fire. That's my little addition. He didn't actually say set some shit on fire. By the summer of '67, violence had become so widespread that some people believed we were headed for another civil war. These uprisings in '67 left 23 people dead in Newark, New Jersey, 43 in Detroit. The violence led President Johnson to appoint a commission to study the causes. And unsurprisingly, this report, the Kerner Report, showed that it's caused by segregation, poverty, and police brutality. The Kerner Report depicted a nation on the verge of being torn apart by these issues, but it didn't offer any proposals for change. With black unemployment twice that of white unemployment, with the average black family income about half that of the average white family, the civil rights movement looked for ways to make freedom real for black Americans. In 1964, Martin Luther King called for a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged to end poverty. He also began to make some statements calling for what will become affirmative action. He said that after doing something against the Negro for hundreds of years, the United States had an obligation to do something for him now. A. Philip Randolph, the guy who had been leading the movement since World War II, he came up with a program of job creation and urban redevelopment. And in 1965, the Chicago Freedom Movement was launched. Dr. King was at the head of this as well. The demands in Chicago were very different from the demands made in the Southern movement. In Chicago, there usually weren't any laws requiring segregation or discrimination, but it still happened. The Chicago movement wanted to end discrimination by the unions. They wanted equal access to mortgages. They wanted integrated public housing. And they were kind of shocked, actually, by the very ferocious opposition that they met in Chicago. A lot of white folks in Chicago had been fully supportive of the civil rights movement when it was in Selma and Montgomery and Natchez, Mississippi. When it moved up to Chicago and said, hey, there are problems that you can fix here, that provoked a lot of violence. As he came to realize the difficulty of combating ingrained economic racism, King's language became much more radical. He called for a revolution in values that would create a better distribution of wealth for all God's children. The first phase of the civil rights movement, the nonviolent church-based phase, that had it had a clear set of objectives: end legal discrimination. They had several very well-organized, highly competent organizations to do it, and so they had some very clear accomplishments. The second phase saw a lot more fragmentation and therefore fewer victories. We usually talk about the nonviolent civil rights movement and the Black Power movement as separate and temporally distinct from each other, but they're really not. The Black Power movement, even though it didn't have that name, was going on in the mid-1950s at the same time as the nonviolent civil rights movement. Even during the heyday of Montgomery, the bus boycott and things like that, Malcolm X was already insisting that black Americans need to control their own resources, rely on their own efforts, and not count on help from white Americans. Malcolm X was from the North. He had committed a string of petty crimes when he was a kid, sent to prison, and he got religion, like most people do. He converted to the Nation of Islam, also known as the Black Muslims. Now we have to define our terms here. It is possible to be a Muslim without being a member of the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam is a political movement. It is possible to be black and be Muslim, and not be a black Muslim member of the Nation of Islam, because that is a political movement. Malcolm X was black, was Muslim, and was also a black Muslim. When he got out of prison, he became one of the spokesmen for the Nation of Islam. And he was a very sharp critic of too much cooperationism, which he felt gave white Americans too much power in what should be essentially a black movement. And he was also very critical of the nonviolent part. Now, again, we need to define what we're talking about. Malcolm X never advocated for black Americans to strike first. He never advocated for civil rights activists to start violence. What he said was, there needs to be an end to turning the other cheek. If you were attacked first, you should fight back. That's mostly what people remember him for. That's not where he ended up. In 1964, Malcolm X made his pilgrimage to Mecca, his Hajj. He's Muslim. Muslims are supposed to make their Hajj at least once in their life if they're able to. And part of the Hajj experience, part of being a good pilgrim, is helping your fellow pilgrims on their way. And so doing this, Malcolm X saw African Muslims, Middle Eastern Muslims, Asian and European Muslims, all of them cooperating, all of them working together for this goal that was important to them as a community. And when he came back to the United States after that, he began to talk about the possibility of racial cooperation. The Nation of Islam did not like that. And in February of 1965, they assassinated him, largely because he was becoming much less radical. So Malcolm X did not leave a coherent ideology behind him. Most whites still believe him to be an advocate of violence. But his call for black Americans to rely on their own resources struck a chord among the urban poor and among younger activists. Malcolm X was kind of the intellectual father of black power, but that term wasn't coined until the mid-60s by Stokely Carmichael. He was a member of SNCC. And black power became a rallying cry for folks who were bitter over the government's unwillingness to stop violence against civil rights workers, who were angry about white attempts to take over leadership in the movement, who were so frustrated over the difficulty of making any lived change. Change the laws. Yeah, the laws have been changed. The laws have been fixed. It's not necessarily making a difference in the lives that people live, and they're so frustrated about that. Black power was a really broad umbrella term. It could mean anything from electing more black politicians to believing that African Americans are a colonized people who can only be free by revolution. But however you used it, on the more conservative end or the more radical end, it reflected a radicalization of young activists, and it sparked an explosion of racial self-confidence, racial self-assertion, like the term black is beautiful. Now, activists and ordinary citizens abandoned the old terminology, like the name Negro, in exchange for African American. They popularized African clothing styles and natural hair, and it's not just a change in fashion. It reflected the idea that it's not wrong to be black and it's not bad to be black, which up to then had been the default belief. Inspired by this activity, SNCC kind of turned its back on its old beloved community idea, and it became part of this new, more militant movement. Many of these militant groups were very short-lived, but both the traditional organizations and quite a few black politicians supported at least some of their ideas. The most prominent of these new groups was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. It was founded in Oakland, California by two college students, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. They created it to address a series of needs in their community: economic needs and cultural and political needs. Now, Seale and Newton are, in many ways, very stereotypical 1960s college students. They wrote up a manifesto. They've got this whole group of anti-imperialist philosophers whose writings they have read and drawn from, like Mao Zedong and Che Guevara and Frantz Fanon. And they believed that urban black Americans were essentially colonial subjects. So they called for self-determination in the ghettos. The Black Panther Party's 10-point program demanded full employment, decent housing, better schools, all the way down to black men being exempt from the draft. Basically saying the United States does not treat them equally, therefore they should not have an equal share in the draft. And they strongly attacked police brutality. This was a severe problem in Oakland. It's still a severe problem in Oakland. Seale and Newton had studied California law, and they knew that it was legal to open carry in California. So they posed like this. They held patrols. They shadowed the police to make sure that the police were not attacking citizens in the streets. Newton and Seale and about 30 other Black Panthers, brandishing these rifles, burst onto the national scene at a demonstration at the Capitol in Sacramento in 1967. And the image of black men with guns just scared the shit out of white people all around the country. The FBI really began to target the Black Panther Party. Quite a bit of internal conflict as well conspired to destroy the organization and scatter the leadership. In 1968, they hit a high of about 5,000 members. 1974, there were like 150 members. Huey Newton was in jail talking about global economic revolution. Bobby Seale turned political, ran for mayor of Oakland unsuccessfully. Eldridge Cleaver preferred to continue with the armed struggle. But they did a lot of other things as well, not just political posturing and demonstrations. They offered free transportation to prisons if you've got a relative there. They offered a school lunch program. They distributed school supplies in their neighborhoods. They published a newsletter publicizing their services and where do you go if you need this service that the Black Panther Party can provide. Black unemployment and economic issues in the black community did improve through the second half of the 1960s. It was never great, but it did improve somewhat. But by '67, though, with the escalation of American military involvement in Vietnam, the war on poverty and the mainstream civil rights movement kind of ground to a halt. And by that point, with the ghetto uprisings, with the anti-war movement getting really loud, with millions of young people rejecting tradition, American society faced its greatest crisis since the Depression. And to a lot of Americans, this protest movement among white students came as such a surprise. For most of ever, universities have been fairly conservative institutions. Most university students came from a very privileged segment of the population. During the 50s, young people were called the silent generation. The problems facing African Americans seemed really obvious, but the grievances of middle-class and upper-class white college students were a little harder to understand. And what could get large numbers of really very affluent and privileged young people to reject the society that gave them that affluence and privilege. In part, the explanation for this comes from a redefinition of freedom among these young people. They called themselves the New Left. Now, a lot of their ideas were not particularly new. What was really new about them was that they were not interested in the old political categories, the old definitions. They didn't like the Communist Party. They didn't like the Democratic Party. They didn't think that the Soviet Union was a good role model the way 30s leftists had. They didn't think that the working class necessarily had to be agents of change. Instead of talking about economic equality and social citizenship like the New Dealers had, the New Left talked about loneliness and alienation and isolation and feeling like you're a cog, right, in a wheel, being powerless in the face of bureaucracy. And this discontent started a mass movement. The New Left's biggest idea, the one that they really clung to, was the idea of participatory democracy. And that idea comes from a document called the Port Huron Statement. It's sort of the stereotypical manifesto of a 60s college student. It was written in 1962. A group called Students for a Democratic Society met up in Port Huron, Michigan, to write this manifesto. The Port Huron Statement, about 80% of it is complaints, criticisms of all sorts of institutions. They don't like the political parties, they don't like corporations, they don't like unions, they don't like the military-industrial complex, they don't really like their parents either. But unlike most other critical documents, including many government studies, the Port Huron Statement does actually have a section with ways to make it better, a new vision for society. The writers said that they wanted a democracy of participation, where the individual shares in those decisions that determine the quality and direction of his life. So freedom and participatory democracy. Broadly, that means everybody is informed and active. Participatory democracy means you get off your butt on election day. You actually go to vote. But it also means that you don't get to just close your eyes and, check wherever your pin lands. You should be informed. You should be involved. It's not just a right, it is a responsibility. The kids of Students for a Democratic Society, they looked around at the world and they wanted to apply that idea to everything. Participatory democracy in politics, in their colleges, in their jobs. And what they found to them was a lot of elitism, where everyday people didn't have a say in what was happening in their own lives. And by the end of 1962, SDS had about 8,000 members. And then a couple of years later, in '64, there was an incident at the University of California at Berkeley that revealed the potential for a very broad coalition of students. Berkeley, even in '62, was a massive, very impersonal, very bureaucratic institution. Many classes, your freshman history class would easily have 1,000 students in it. Your professor doesn't know who you are, don't really care who you are. And the administration at Berkeley made a rule. There's protests spreading, civil rights protests mostly at this point spreading. They don't want any of that here. So they made a rule that political groups, no political groups, can speak, distribute pamphlets, hold sit-ins, do anything on Central Campus. Well, every Berkeley student is outraged about this. Liberals are upset, conservatives are upset too, because it applies to every political group. And they came together to create the free speech movement. They said that restricting their speech is restricting their dignity as human beings, and thousands of Berkeley students got involved in this. At first, they just wanted that one rule repealed. Then they started criticizing the entire structure of the university, then the U.S. educational system as a whole, and then they just didn't stop criticizing. By 1965, the Civil Rights Movement and the New Left together had kind of shattered that complacency that was left over from the 50s. But what took these protests and transformed it into a full-fledged generational rebellion was the war in Vietnam. Now, the Vietnam War, which was never actually a declared war, so it's more accurately a police action, the police action in Vietnam was a logical extension of our Cold War policies and our assumptions about the world. It showed us the danger of viewing the entire world and every situation through a with us or against us kind of lens. Very few Americans had any knowledge of Vietnam's history or culture or what was going on there, couldn't find it on a map. By the time Johnson took office, what was a complex struggle for national independence that was coincidentally led by communists had been reduced in the media and the public mindset to those damn commies trying to take over the world. Truman and then Eisenhower had supported France when they were trying to keep hold of their Vietnamese colony. After the French were defeated, they gave money to South Vietnamese leaders who were capitalist, but who refused to hold any elections. So the South Vietnamese regime that we support is corrupt. The North Vietnamese regime is violent. The Vietnamese people are screwed either way. Now, the situation kept getting worse, but both Kennedy and Johnson were afraid that the American public would react badly if we lost Vietnam like we lost China. So we stayed involved. First with money, then with military advisors. 17,000 military advisors were sent to South Vietnam. Now, the Viet Cong, that's the North Vietnamese army, they began to invade and take control of the countryside in South Vietnam. And the leader of South Vietnam, our buddy Jim, is becoming more and more dictator-like, trying to keep a hold of South Vietnam. And when even the Buddhists in South Vietnam started supporting the Viet Cong, we decided that Jim has to go. The U.S. approved a military coup that overthrew him and then accidentally killed him. Now, when Johnson became president, he had really very little experience in foreign policy. He didn't particularly want to commit U.S. troops to Vietnam, but he also didn't want to lose Vietnam. In August of '64, something happened. North Vietnamese vessels. North Vietnamese is the communist part of Vietnam. Some North Vietnamese ships encountered an American ship and may or may not have fired upon that American ship that may or may not have been spying off the coast of North Vietnam. Still classified. We don't exactly know what happened. We don't know if anything happened. Johnson used that event to declare that North Vietnam had aggressed upon the United States and to ask Congress for permission to do something. He didn't ask for a declaration of war, and Congress did not give him a declaration of war. Instead, they passed a resolution called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which is where this incident, whatever it was, took place. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution authorized the president to take, this is a direct quote, all necessary measures in Vietnam. Again, it's very, very vague. It's like a blank check. There's no discussion of goals or strategy or when you know you've won or when you know you've lost and you need to leave. During the '64 presidential campaign, Johnson insisted no intention of sending U.S. troops to Vietnam. But immediately after his re-election, the National Security Council recommended that we start airstrikes against the North, send ground troops into the South, and Johnson sent the troops. By 1968, there were more than 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam, and the conduct of the war on both sides was brutal. The Viet Cong massacred tens of thousands of civilians. They would kill wounded or surrendering U.S. soldiers. I'm sure you're all familiar with John McCain. If you've ever noticed, John McCain has trouble with his hands sometimes. He was in a Vietnamese POW camp and he was tortured, and that's one of the lingering effects of that. American planes dropped more tons of bombs on Vietnam than both sides used in World War II. We also spread Agent Orange. Agent Orange was a chemical that was supposed to destroy the forests. But the Viet Cong would hide in the forests and the trees, and we couldn't see them. Well, we kill off all the trees, then they've got nowhere to hide. The problem is Agent Orange caused birth defects in the native population and massive nerve disorders in U.S. troops, which a lot of men still feel the effects of. We dropped napalm, which is like gasoline in a gel form that sticks to your skin. Fun. Despite this, the Viet Cong continued to fight. As the casualties built, as the bombs kept falling, our Cold War cooperation began to unravel. By 1968, the war had basically sidetracked the Great Society, the Civil Rights Movement, torn families and universities and the Democratic Party apart. With most of the mainstream established political leadership committed to the war for most of the decade, young activists lost all confidence in what they called the system. Opposition to the war became a theme that united lots of people from all different groups with very different kinds of problems. SNCC issued a position paper condemning the war. College students were exempt from the draft, so the burden of fighting fell on the working class and the poor, and they protested. Although I should probably point out that, in fact, a higher percentage of the U.S. military in the Vietnam War was volunteer than had been in World War II. So a lot of young people didn't protest. This is not 100% youth rebellion. But in 1967, Martin Luther King condemned the Vietnam War, both as an unconscionable use of violence and also because it drained resources away from the United States at a time when we really needed it. At that point, King was the most prominent American to speak out against the war. As for the Students for a Democratic Society, this war is like the opposite of participatory democracy. We'd gotten involved through secret commitments, through secret decisions, not through a public referendum. In April of '65, SDS invited people who opposed the war to meet up in Washington, D.C. They weren't really expecting a huge group. They got 25,000 people. It's the first hint that the anti-war movement was more widespread than they had imagined. By 1967, some young men were burning their draft cards, running away to Canada, partly because they considered this an unjust war, and partly because whether or not a war is just, people die, and that's not appealing. In October of 1967, 100,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. They marched down to the Pentagon, where, in just the most stereotypical hippie move ever, they stuck flowers down the barrels of the Guards' rifles. Now, the New Left and their definition of freedom, at first, was very politically centered. But as the 60s went on, young Americans' definition of freedom expanded to include cultural freedoms. Now, there were a whole bunch of different streams all flowing together to create the counterculture. But they were all linked in that they wouldn't have been possible as a movement if the war hadn't destroyed their faith in and their respect for authority. By the late 1960s, millions of young people openly rejected the values and the behaviors of their culture. These included not just college students, but also a lot of young workers, because again, the burden of the war kind of fell on them. there became a mass movement that was essentially based on finding the most flamboyant ways to reject respectable norms in clothing and language and sex and drug use. And Bob Dylan sang, "Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command." And boy, that freaked folks out. There was a lot more to the counterculture than just sex, drugs, and rock and roll. To the people involved, it meant creativity. It meant building a new world for yourself. It meant rejecting consumerism. Although that didn't really work out so well, they just bought different stuff. You know, their parents had bought the gray flannel suits and the pillbox hats. These kids are buying dashikis and Grateful Dead posters. They're still buying. The counterculture encouraged new, kind of weird forms of political activism. Underground newspapers pioneered a new style of journalism. There was a group called the Youth International Party, also known as the Yippies. They used theatricality as a form of protest. They were protesting capitalism one time, and they tossed a whole bunch of dollar bills out onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. And the entire stock market screeched to a halt as these stockbrokers went scrambling after the money. The counterculture also talked about community. So places like New York's East Village or Haight-Ashbury or more than 2,000 communes spread across the country, that's a part of the counterculture. Music festivals like Woodstock brought hundreds of thousands of young people together to celebrate their alternativeness. And the counterculture's idea of liberation centered on the individual, the free individual and their choices. In many ways, this is drawing heavily from the lyrical left of the progressive era. And this became most evident in the concept of sexual freedom. Starting in 1960, the mass marketing of birth control pills made it possible to almost completely, not entirely, but almost completely separate sex from procreation. By the late 60s, sexual freedom was as big a part of this youth rebellion as long hair and the Rolling Stones and drug experimentation. Music celebrated the free expression of sexuality. There's a hit musical on Broadway called Hair, where depending on exactly how naked your actors wanted to be, you could be naked for basically the entire play. The sexual revolution was central to another mass movement that came out of the 60s, the second wave of feminism. Now, the Civil Rights Revolution, followed by the rise of the New Left student movement, that inspired other Americans to step up and claim their rights. Many borrowed the confrontational tactics of the civil rights movements. They adopted that language of power and liberation. And by the late 60s, there were new social movements all over the political landscape. And one of these was women's liberation. Now, the first wave of feminism had been the suffrage movement, getting the vote. Once we got the vote, though, which, remember, we've had for less than 100 years, once we got it, it didn't actually seem to affect regular, everyday women's personal power or economic choices. And despite the fact that women had worked in heavy industry during World War II, into the 1970s, newspapers were still dividing job ads into male and female. You can check the archives of the Miami News Record, or probably any other newspaper that you can get your hands on. Look for the Girl Wanted ads. They're usually limited to typists and low-wage clerical stuff. Major universities would limit the number of female students that they accept. We'll take a few. We don't want to take too many, because, you know, girls are only there to get their MRS degrees. Spell it out. MRS. Spells Mrs. Girls aren't really in college to get an education. They're just looking for husbands. In many states, husbands were still controlling their wives' earnings. Paychecks were not coming to women in their own names. They were going to their husbands. Women couldn't establish credit in their own names. That was true in Oklahoma until the 1970s, when the Supreme Court finally stepped in. Women could not have credit in their own names. As late as 1970, the Ohio State Supreme Court said that a woman was, at most, a superior servant without legally recognized rights. Now, even during the 50s, some folks had been worried that the country was wasting literally half our human power by restricting access to education and industry. But the real public reawakening of feminist thought didn't get its start until 1963, when Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique. Friedan had been a journalist. She'd written pioneering articles during World War II about pay discrimination and racism in the workplace. But like a lot of other social critics in the 50s and 60s, when she wrote The Feminine Mystique, her theme was about the emptiness of consumer culture and lack of participatory democracy, the inability to have a voice in the decisions that affect your lives. Her book painted, and it's a nonfiction book, it's a research book, it painted a really devastating picture of talented, educated women trapped in a world that didn't just view marriage and motherhood as a good goal, but as the only goal. Friedan herself was a graduate of Smith College. She'd been working on a PhD in psychology at Stanford University when she left to get married. She had 3 kids. She kept working as a freelance writer when she could find time. But, you know, finding time for mom to write was not a priority in their home. And while she loved her kids and she enjoyed some parts of being a homemaker, she wanted to use all of her talents in education. And when she went to a college reunion, she found that all of her classmates were in exactly the same situation. Very few books have had the impact that The Feminine Mystique had. Friedan was swamped with really pitiful, desperate letters from female readers talking about how the suburban dream home turned into a nightmare. And of course, she got a few letters calling her a godless heathen for not being totally fulfilled by changing diapers. The laws slowly began to address feminist concerns. In 1963, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, which said that if 2 people have the same job and the same rank in that job, they ought to be paid the same. Now, enforcement of that was extremely spotty, and it still is. In fact, in 2009, there was yet another Fair Pay Act being passed. Well, the Civil Rights Act of '64 did include women. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission became a major force in breaking down barriers to women's access to jobs. In 1966, the National Organization for Women, NOW, with Betty Friedan as president, was formed. It was very explicitly modeled on civil rights organizations. They demanded opportunities in jobs and education and politics. Now, the National Organization for Women was very much an outgrowth of middle-class feminism. But a different, more radical revolt was brewing among young women. Just like in the days of abolition, young women who got involved in political movements, like the student movement or the civil rights movement, faced inequality and faced exploitation. You know, women like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer had played major roles in grassroots organizations. But a lot of women in the movement, especially in more traditional civil rights organizations, found themselves stuck doing the typing and the cooking and sometimes the cleaning for male co-workers, and some of them were pressured into granting sexual favors to male members. When Stokely Carmichael became the head of SNCC in 1965, he infamously said, "The only position for a woman in the movement is prone." Now, he meant that as a joke, but he was mocking very prevalent attitudes. A group of female SNCC activists really didn't like the change in their organization, and they wrote a memo pointing out that there were a lot of parallels between the treatment of women in SNCC and the treatment of black people outside of it. And what bothered them most was the status of women in a group that was supposed to be about freedom. That the same complaints were coming out of the student movement. One student leader wrote, "The movement is supposed to be about freedom. How come the condition of women inside it is no better than outside?" The growing number of women in college, especially at state universities, created a ready-made constituency for this new feminism. By 1967, women across the country were having consciousness-raising sessions to discuss the challenges that they faced and to connect with other women who were dealing with the same thing. Many of them believed that the National Organization for Women, that now, was just not radical enough. It was led by a fairly affluent, middle-aged, married mother of three. Well, this new, younger, more militant feminism burst onto the public scene at the Miss America pageant in 1968. Protesters brought in called it a freedom trash can. It was just a big metal drum. And they filled it with objects of oppression, like girdles and bras and high heels and copies of Playboy magazine. They didn't actually set anything on fire, but the media called them bra burners anyway. The Women's Live movement inspired a major expansion of the idea of freedom because they insisted that it needed to be applied to all areas of life, even the most intimate. They introduced the terms sexism and sexual politics and the personal is political into public debate. And they insisted that sex and marriage conditions were just as much political questions as war and the economy. And the idea that family life is not off limits for discussion of power and justice permanently changed Americans' definition of freedom. And it also opened the door for more protection, not just for women in the home, but for children as well. Before this era, child abuse was not something that the public or the police or politics got involved in any way unless it became very extreme. Because of this idea that the personal is political, that what is happening to you in your home is something that needs to be addressed, then we start having people take issues like domestic abuse and child abuse much more seriously. Now, the radical feminists' first political campaign demanded the repeal of state laws that banned abortion or left it up to physicians to decide without the input of women. They claimed that these laws took away a woman's power over her own health care decisions. In 1969, a group of young activists disrupted hearings in the New York legislature. The New York was having hearings about their state abortion law, and the experts who were called to testify were 14 men and one Catholic nun. And the protesters pointed out that none of those people would ever need abortions, and perhaps were not the correct people to speak as experts. Now, the call for legalized abortion took the old 19th century demand for control over your own body and merged it with the 1960s emphasis on sexual freedom. Now, opposition to that particular plank of the feminist platform became and remains a major sticking point. But the concerns of Women's Live went way beyond abortion. They protested violence against women, including marital rape, which was not recognized as a crime. It was totally legal for a husband to rape his wife. In fact, it was not made illegal in all 50 states until 1993. They talked about inequality in the law, in the workforce, in families, in their churches and synagogues. And while the more mainstream groups, like NOW, didn't really care that much about gay rights and really discouraged lesbians from joining, many of the more radical feminist groups addressed their issues as well. Now, as in the case of African Americans, A movement for legal rights had been building for a long time among Mexican Americans. But the mid-60s saw much more militancy. Like Black Power activists, this movement emphasized pride in their past and also the new Chicano culture that they had created in the United States. Unlike the Black Power movement, Latino activism was closely linked to labor struggles. And one of the big leaders of this movement, two of the big leaders of this movement, were actually labor leaders, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Now, Chavez was the son of migrant farm workers. He was kind of a disciple of Martin Luther King, and he began to lead a series of nonviolent protests in 1965 to pressure California corporate farms to agree to labor contracts with the United Farm Workers Union. And United Farm Workers was as much a mass movement for civil rights as a workers' union. The boycott of California grapes that they established mobilized Latino communities throughout the Southwest. It drew national attention to the really pitifully low wages and disgustingly oppressive working conditions that migrant laborers faced. In 1970, the major growers finally agreed to contracts with United Farm Workers. In New York City, a group called the Young Lords Organization, which actually started out as a street gang, turned political and modeled themselves after the Black Panthers. Geraldo Rivera, he's on Fox News today, he started his legal career as an attorney for the Young Lords. They staged demonstrations to protest high unemployment rates among Puerto Ricans and other Latinos. They held protests against the lack of city services in Latino neighborhoods, like garbage collection. In New York City, the city handles garbage collection. It's a part of your taxes. If you pay your city taxes, your garbage is supposed to get picked up. But they weren't going into poorer neighborhoods, in particular poorer neighborhoods of color. So the Young Lords gathered up about a week's worth of garbage and dumped it in the middle of Fifth Avenue to draw attention to the fact that the city was not providing services to all of its tax-paying citizens. Now, like SNCC and SDS, the Latino movement also gave rise to some feminist discontent. Many Chicano and Puerto Rican men thought that feminist demands were not compatible with their heritage. The young women in the movement, they viewed the sexual double standard and the inequality of women as not compatible with the freedom that they are supposed to be working for. In a decade full of surprises, probably the biggest shock of all was the emergence of a gay rights movement. We've been fighting for the rights of racial minorities and women for a long time. Gay men and lesbians, they were stigmatized as sinful or as mentally ill. In fact, the original, if you're a psych student and you've seen the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the very first one of those described homosexuality as sexual psychopathy. And there were all sorts of treatments to make someone stop being homosexual. Lobotomies were fairly common. Electroshock therapy was extremely common. They wet you down and give you some electric shocks so you don't have those thoughts anymore. If you like listening to 70s glam rock and you're familiar with Lou Reed, he went through electroshock therapy. Most states made homosexual acts illegal. Even where it wasn't illegal, the police would harass the gay subculture because it was an embarrassment to be arrested for that. So you're near the end of the month, you haven't made your quota, go raid the gay bar, arrest all of them. Even if they're not actually breaking a law, they will probably just pay the fine and quietly go home. McCarthyism believed that homosexuality was a communist plot. It's a source of national weakness, so anti-communist crusaders were really harsh on suspected gay people. Most homosexuals tried to keep their orientation secret or in the closet, tried to live as if they were straight. Starting in the 1950s, some groups tried to persuade the public that gay Americans were just average people who ought not to be persecuted. But just like with all of the other movements, the 60s transformed the gay rights movement into something more militant. And if any one event marked the start of gay liberation, it was a 1969 police raid on the Stonewall Bar in New York's Greenwich Village. Stonewall was a favorite target. You could go in and haul everybody out, make a lot of fine money. Usually, the folks at Stonewall would just keep their heads down and pay the fine and go home. This time they didn't. Crowds from the neighborhood gathered outside the bar, mostly watching as people were loaded into police vans, until one officer smashed a trans woman over the head with a billy club. And at that point, all hell broke loose. People who were already cuffed and loaded escaped from the wagon, which they then overturned, and 5 days of rioting followed. Some of it violent, some of it... Well, at one point there was a line of police facing off with a kick line of drag queens, and a militant movement was born. Gay men and lesbians stepped out of the closet to insist that their orientation was a part of their identity. Within a few years, gay pride marches were being held in numerous cities. And the 1960s also saw an upsurge in Native militancy. Despite the Indian Reorganization Act of the New Deal, which was supposed to stop forced assimilation, the Eisenhower administration had tried to go back to the old way of dealing with Indians. When Kennedy came into office, he's not really all that interested in domestic stuff anyway, so he abandoned the policy of assimilation, but otherwise didn't really do much. Johnson's War on Poverty had earmarked some money to go to the reservations. But like every other rights group, Indian activists wanted not economic aid. They wanted participatory democracy. They wanted more self-determination. They used language that was very typical of the 60s. The president of the National Indian Youth Council said, "We are not free in the most basic sense of the word. We are not allowed to make those basic human choices about our personal lives and the destiny of our communities." And the American Indian Movement was founded in Minneapolis in 1968, and they began to hold protests to demand more tribal sovereignty, to demand that the United States honor the hundreds of treaties that it had made with the various nations. In 1969, a group that called itself Indians of All Nations occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, or for their point of view, re-occupied. Alcatraz had been Indian land. When the U.S. government first took it over, they had signed a treaty with the nation that lived there, saying that once the United States no longer had a use for it, they would give it back. Well, it had been used as a prison. But the prison closed in 1963, and nothing was being done with it. And the prison was rotting. So the Indians of All Nations said, "Hey, treaty, give it back." And the U.S. government said no. Well, the protests there lasted for almost 2 years, and quite a few people who later became leaders in their various nations took part in the Alcatraz protest, like Wilma Mankiller. Huge around here. She's the first female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. She was part of the support staff of this occupation. 2 of her siblings were on the island. This particular protest launched the Red Power movement. That phrase was coined by Vine Deloria. He's a native author who wrote Custer Died for Your Sins, which is a really good book. In the early 1970s, the American Indian movement held protests at Mount Rushmore, carving the faces of 4 white guys onto land that is sacred to the Lakota Nation. Let's see, they actually occupied the office of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. for almost a week. They had traveled to Washington, D.C. They called it the Trail of Broken Treaties, and President Nixon said that he would meet with them. And then when they got there, he wouldn't do it. So they just set up and occupied the BIA offices. In 1973, they occupied the town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota for 3 months in commemoration/protest of the Wounded Knee massacre and the continued predation on the Native communities in South Dakota. Eventually, their activism will win greater tribal control over education, over economic development, and maybe even most importantly, it will create an increase in self-respect, especially among young people who previously had tried to hide their identities. These liberation movements, the African American movement, the women's lib movement, the gay movement, those challenged long-standing social inequalities. The environmental movement called into question different pillars of American life. It questioned whether progress has to mean consumption. It questioned whether science and technology and economic growth always are implemented to benefit society. And the environmental movement is actually very old. There were water purity protests being held in the 1820s and 1830s. The preservation movement has been around since the late 1800s. But in keeping with everything else happening in the 60s, the new environmental movement was a lot more active, a lot more youth-oriented, and it talked about empowering citizens to participate in the decisions that affect their lives. Environmentalism came to be seen as a quality of life issue because it affected your fitness and your health and how you can enjoy your leisure time. So this movement in particular became very prominent with middle-class Americans. When the 60s began, people were already complaining about bulldozing the forests for suburbs and chemical contamination into the water supply. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland burst into flames 4 times in the 1950s. Water's not supposed to burn. In 1962, a marine biologist named Rachel Carson published Silent Spring. That was a study on the effects of DDT. DDT was an insecticide that was widely used not just by corporate farms, but by homeowners. DDT killed not just insects, but birds and animals and people. It caused cancer and miscarriages in humans. Now, chemical companies and pesticide companies launched a campaign to discredit Rachel Carson. They said it's a communist plot. But Carson launched the modern environmental movement. The Sierra Club had actually been founded in the 1890s, but after Silent Spring, its membership tripled. Other groups sprang up to talk about the danger of water contamination and air pollution, lead in paint, and animal extinction. Nearly every state very quickly banned the use of DDT, and it is currently banned in agricultural use worldwide. Although there are some countries where it is allowed to be used to stop the spread of malaria, which is carried by mosquitoes. There are some countries where malaria is actually a bigger health problem than cancer. In 1969, people got to watch live on TV a massive oil spill happening off the coast of California, which created a movement to stop or slow offshore drilling. Environmentalism got support from both sides of the political aisle. It's Republican President Richard Nixon in the late 60s and early 70s that will encourage Congress to pass the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970 by 20 million people. Closely related to environmentalism was the consumer protection movement. It was led by a lawyer named Ralph Nader. He had published a report called Unsafe at Any Speed that exposed how automakers knowingly sold very dangerous vehicles. He particularly attacked the Chevy Corvair, which had a nasty habit of exploding. And General Motors hired private investigators to discredit Nader. When they were caught, GM had to pay him a settlement, which he used to investigate a bunch of other dangerous products and misleading advertising. And Nader's campaign laid the groundwork for a lot of the consumer protection laws that we have today. Now, most of the movements of the 1960s, like all of the rights movements, emphasized personal freedom. But environmentalism and the consumer movement called for some limits on certain kinds of freedom in the name of a greater common good. While the rights revolution began in the streets, it became legitimized through the courts, which is historically the most conservative branch of government. Under the guidance of Chief Justice Earl Warren, the court vastly expanded protection for rights that should be enjoyed by all Americans. And it tried, in many cases, to put those rights out of the reach of local officials. Like we talked about before, the court had started kind of tentatively championing civil liberties in the late 20s, early 30s, when they declared that free expression deserved protection. Now, the McCarthy era had hurt that. But by the late 50s, early 60s, the court was starting to build back up. Earl Warren, Chief Justice Warren, declared that the government could prosecute illegal actions, but not dissent. And by the time he retired in 1969, the court had reaffirmed the right to First Amendment protection, even for unpopular opinions, and had basically dismantled the McCarthy-era loyalty system. Civil liberties had gained protection in the 1930s because they were associated with labor rights. In the 50s and 60s, they were all mixed up with civil rights. The court began to strike down Southern laws that were meant to discourage people from joining civil rights groups. Like there were laws, Alabama had a law said that the NAACP had to publish its member list with names and addresses, which I think you can see in Alabama that's not like the safest thing to do, and the Supreme Court said you can't make them do that. Right? People are allowed to associate with who they want to associate with without state interference. The court also overturned a libel judgment against the New York Times. The New York Times had been reporting on events in Birmingham and Selma and all of that stuff, and Alabama got annoyed, and they sued the state of New York for, or not the state of New York, they sued the New York Times for reporting on these absolutely true and factual events. And the Supreme Court said, if you don't want the New York Times to report on what you're doing, stop doing it. The court said that the central meaning of the First Amendment, the meaning of freedom of the press, was the right of citizens to criticize their government. And just for good measure, they also went back and declared the Sedition Act of 1798 unconstitutional, even though it had expired 150 years before. The court continued to push toward racial equality. They overturned a whole bunch of Jim Crow laws. In Loving v. Virginia, it overturned laws against interracial marriage. In 1968, it forbade discrimination in real estate again. The court also said that it is the state's responsibility to protect civil liberties, that your Bill of Rights, your protections are not just protections against the federal government, they're protections against the state government. Like protections against illegal search and seizure, and the right to a speedy trial and the right to an attorney. They said the states must protect those. One of the most important of those decisions was Miranda v. Arizona. That said that an individual accused of a crime must be informed of their right to remain silent and their right to an attorney, and must be told that any statement they make can be used against them in court. And that decision made Miranda warnings standard police procedure. The court also started to oversee the fairness of election laws. Baker v. Carr said that voting districts need to be roughly equal in population. You're not supposed to have a rural district with 5,000 people having the same number of representatives as a major urban center with 5 million people, which is why like the entirety of western Kansas is one congressional district. They also strengthened the wall of separation between church and state. Like the state of Maryland, into the 1960s, required all of their public officials to swear that they weren't atheists. And the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. The Constitution specifically says there will be no religious test for holding office, so stop it. The court also said that public schools could not hold official prayers and Bible readings, although they did say that students are free to organize their own prayer groups if they want to. The Warren Court expanded all sorts of protections that had slowly been building for a while. They also protected some new concepts, like the right to privacy. The right to privacy was declared in Griswold v. Connecticut. That case overturned a state law that banned contraceptives. Justice William Douglas wrote that the right to be left alone is the beginning of all freedom. Now, the Griswold decision only overturned laws that banned the use of contraceptive by married couples. But the court had later decisions that transformed it into a right, the right to privacy, as a right of all individuals. Those decisions led directly to the most controversial decision that built on those rulings, although it won't happen until 1972 after Chief Justice Warren has retired, and that is Roe v. Wade. Griswold and Roe and all of these other decisions unleashed a flood of rulings and laws that have redefined the family, not as a unit with a single leader, but as a collection of sovereign individuals who all have rights. The legal rights of women in the home began to expand. Law enforcement began to take domestic violence at least slightly seriously, which for centuries was not seen as the law's business unless somebody died. And today, some notion of individual rights is central to most Americans' idea of freedom. Now, the rights revolution took American freedom and made it not a set of privileges that only some people had, but an open-ended claim to equality and recognition and self-determination. And the 1960s reached their climax in 1968. This is a year when momentous events happened one after another so fast that for a lot of people the foundation of American society seemed in danger of cracking. Late in January '68, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a very surprising and very well-organized series of uprisings in cities throughout South Vietnam. Completely shocked American military leaders. Now, the U.S. did manage to drive them back, did inflict heavy damage on the Viet Cong, but the fact that we were totally unprepared for it, and the intensity of the fighting, which was shown on TV, shattered public confidence in President Johnson. He had repeatedly said that victory is just around the corner, and it is clearly not. Leading members of the press joined the chorus criticizing American involvement in the war. Eugene McCarthy, an anti-war senator from Minnesota, announced that he would challenge President Johnson for the Democratic nomination in 1968. And Johnson decided he would just step down. He will not seek re-election. Meanwhile, Martin Luther King was organizing a Poor People's March. He wanted to bring demonstrators to Washington to demand a renewed commitment to the war on poverty. He also began to lend much more support to workers' unions, to the fight for workers, to collective bargaining. He went down to Memphis in April. And on the 4th of April, King was killed by a white assassin in Memphis. And the greatest outbreak of urban violence in the nation's history followed. Washington, D.C. had to be occupied by soldiers before order was restored. People every now and then wonder, when there's violence today, what would Dr. King say? And you know, we would be able to ask him, if someone hadn't shot him. As a gesture to King's memory, Congress passed its last major civil rights law, the Open Housing Act, which banned discrimination in real estate. The Supreme Court has already done that like 6 times now. At the end of April, students at Columbia University took over 7 campus buildings to protest the university getting money from the government for defense research. New York police removed them, but the assault left hundreds of protesters and totally innocent bystanders injured, and it led to a strike that shut down the campus. In June, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in San Diego while he was campaigning for president. In August, tens of thousands of activists went to Chicago for the Democratic National Convention, and the Chicago police force, which has never been known for its restraint, assaulted the marchers with nightsticks. A congressional investigation called the event a police riot. It's not the demonstrators rioting at all, it was the police. Like 1919, 1968 was a year of worldwide upheaval. It's a turning point. And like 1919, it's a turning point on which history failed to turn. In Paris, there was a nationwide student uprising that was very similar to American student movements. Demands for educational reform, participatory democracy, personal freedom. French workers joined in, led to a general strike that paralyzed the country and then was shut down. In Czechoslovakia, reformist leaders came to power and were then ousted by a Soviet invasion. In Mexico, students at the University of Mexico, which is the oldest university in the Western Hemisphere, began to protest, but the Olympics were supposed to be held in Mexico City in 1968. The government of Mexico did not want anybody to see these protests, so they called out the soldiers on them. 500 students were killed. In the United States, instead of radical change, the events of 1968 opened the door for a conservative counter-reaction. The turmoil in the streets led to a demand for law and order, which basically meant shut up. Black militancy produced a white backlash, and that played a huge role in politics. Some groups were angry that the Supreme Court was protecting rights for all these other people instead of their local traditions. In August, Richard Nixon was nominated as the Republican candidate for president. He campaigned as the champion of the great silent majority, ordinary Americans who believe that change has gone too far. He also called for a renewed commitment to law and order, which with the benefit of hindsight is pretty funny. Nixon won the election, barely, with a 0.6% majority of the popular vote. And so the 1960s, as an era of social change, comes to a screeching halt. And that is the limit of what you will be tested over on the final.